Hello, welcome to the second installment of this semester's Gender Talk series. My name is Dr. M. Shadi Malaklu, and I am the chair of Women's and Gender Studies at Berea College and the founding director of its Women's and Gender Nonconforming Center. Thank you for joining us today for a virtual talk with Associate Professor of American and Women's Studies at the University of New Mexico, Dr. Amy L. Branzell. Dr. Branzell received their PhD in Feminist Studies with a minor in History at the University of Minnesota. They teach in the areas of queer and feminist theory, citizenship, law, and social justice. Their research examines the relationship between the ways in which we think about the world and how we live out our normative identities in ways that thwart intersectional coalitions and justice. Dr. Branzell's first book, Against Citizenship, The Violence of the Normative, released in 2016, demonstrates how citizenship requires an anti-intersectional approach. In other words, strategies that deny the ways in which race, class, gender, indigeneity, sexuality, and nation are mutually and contingently produced. According to Dr. Branzell, academics and leftist scholars are especially prone to reproduce these strategies. Their scholarship has been published in Feminist Formations, Feminist Studies, Gay and Lesbian Quarterly, and Women's Studies Quarterly. Dr. Branzell is currently working on their next book project, tentatively titled Queer Knowledge, the Law of Difference in Academe, which explores how diversity, difference, and the otherwise complexities of our identities are produced, managed, and disciplined within academic institutions. Which is to say, much of the criticism that today's events have received misunderstand Dr. Branzell's scholarship as a leftist one. To the contrary, their work is critical of the liberal politics that would have us believe that we are free when we are, as today's respondent, Berea's own Dr. Mireille J. Pardone discusses, most definitely not. Dr. Pardone is an assistant professor of history at Berea College. She received a PhD in history from Yale University in 2020 and is currently working on a book-length manuscript about judicial administration and cultural ideas about homicide in 15th century Flemish cities. Her research explores violence, gender, and judicial ritual in medieval and early modern Europe. We regret that we cannot host Dr. Branzell and Dr. Pardone and all of you in person in our center on Berea's beautiful campus over a hearty lunch as we usually do. We hope to resume on-campus programming as soon as it is safe to do so, hopefully in the fall. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the hard work of my colleagues, namely Women's and Gender Studies Associate Kimberly Staderholm and student programmer Mandy Snowden, both of whom helped to organize today's event. We also want to thank the very many people on Berea's campus who rallied to support today's event, despite receiving so much hateful correspondence. We are in your debt in more ways than I can enumerate. Additionally, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Law, Ethics, and Society minor at Berea College and Western Kentucky University's Gender and Women's Studies Department. Thank you for your support of this and other programming to come out of our Women's and Gender Nonconforming Center. In response to the criticisms that today's events have received, I feel it is important to remind our community that it has been the goal of our center since its founding in November 2019 to merge Berea College's great commitment to racial equity with its great commitment to gender equity, so that we might all better interrogate the intersections that contribute to race, sex, and gender violence, not least of all for sex and gender minorities of color. My colleagues, staff, and I are committed to helping Bereans to think critically and deeply about the prejudices that all of us share, because we are all deeply entrenched in what Berea's own Bell Hooks describes as imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. We are grateful for today's opportunity for open and honest dialogue about these prejudices. Those openings are admittedly uncomfortable, but that is exactly why they are important to the motto and mission of Berea College, to quote, make of one blood all peoples of the earth. I therefore ask that we use today's talk as an opportunity to honor John G. Fee's radical abolitionism and to enact the kind of coalitional politics that he championed and which is responsible for Berea College's founding. Without any further delay, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Dr. Amy L. Branzell, and respondent, Dr. Mireille J. Pardone. You are welcome to ask questions throughout using the Q&A function on your Zoom dashboard. We will address your questions at the end. Thank you. Dr. Branzell? Dr. Branzell, you're muted.
Classic Zoom problems. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. Thank you so much, Sade and Marae, for inviting me and for your contributions, for helping me present today. I'm so thankful for everyone who organized this. I really wish I was there in person. I also want to thank everyone, knowing that this is a pandemic and this is a rough time for all of us. And so I'm just going to really just thank you again for even spending some time and putting any of your energy into this talk today. I really appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share screen. Can you see it, Sade? Can you see it? Anyone?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So my talk is subtly titled White Citizenship as Terrorism, Make America Great Again. Partly because I'm a little bit known for trying to do a talk title that is intriguing and then brings an audience in. Sounds like it worked. I also wanted to just admit that I am, this is a land acknowledgement for me. I'm here in the University of New Mexico, which is in Albuquerque area. And so I am a white settler who lives in and on unceded Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache lands. So I hear there's been some press and some controversy around this talk today. Interestingly enough, it's those controversies and the ways that some media have described this talk, or reacted to the description of the talk actually, is exactly the point. That is, there are tendencies to situate whiteness as vulnerable, as in trouble, as needing protection. And that's exactly the kind of discourse that I'm trying to name today and trying to figure out what we do with that. To say that whiteness needs protection, needs media up in arms, needs people to send threatening emails to my colleagues here or myself. This is the narrative of white woundedness that my talk is very much about today. Because historically, as well as contemporarily, whiteness has been synonymous with American or US citizenship. I'm a citizenship studies scholar, and this is one of the things that's the most profound part of my work. As such, whiteness has been imbued with rights and privileges of citizenship without question. The first law that conferred citizenship in the United States, the Naturalization Law of 1790, limited naturalization to free white persons only and remained in place until 1952. That law was modified in 1870 after the Emancipation to include African Americans, but as we know, Jim Crow and other social and legal practices would severely limit their right and access to citizenship for decades to come. But throughout US legal history, whiteness itself was never questioned as the right to citizenship. This isn't to say that whiteness itself isn't contested, it's complicated. Numerous folks have come forward, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries and even early 20th centuries, claiming that they were white and therefore had the right to citizenship. But the connection between whiteness and citizenship, that connection has never been severed in law. That is not at all the case for non-white racial identities. That is Asian Americans, Blacks, South Asians, Africans, Mexican Americans, Latin Americans, the list goes on and on. Those communities have had to fight, beg, and then fight again for the legal rights to citizenship. Some of our most important and life-altering Supreme Court cases focused on excluding non-whites from citizenship. We can consider, for example, the famous 1858 Dred Scott case, in which the Supreme Court declared that free men were not citizens. We can also turn to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. The Supreme Court famously ruled that segregation of people of color from whites was legal. Interestingly enough, the dissent by Justice Harlan has been considered this kind of bulwark against the racism of the time, was considered the most salvageable aspect of the decision. But it's important to note that Justice Harlan argued that segregation shouldn't occur for African Americans only because they deserved some rights compared to what he considered the most foreign, most unassimilable, the race so different from our own that we do not permit those belonging to it to become citizens of the United States, that is, Asians. But race and racial decisions are never just about race. Gender has been a key element to racialized rights, and gender directly impacted access to whiteness. So that 1790 naturalization law that I earlier showed you, that limited citizenship to free white persons, but it also had another caveat, that only free white men could bestow or transmit their citizenship to their children. Women could not. This law and the woman question raised confusions for the court. Were white women citizens? And if they were citizens, did that mean they had rights? Or is there a special type of citizenship for white women? The answer differed over time. Courts did debate and try to figure out whether or not white women did have citizenship. And honestly, the most common answer was kinda. So in 1805, the court found that a white woman was a citizen, but only in the sense that it was a derivative element from her husband's citizenship. That is, her citizenship was only through the proximity and actions of her husband. This type of derivative citizenship allowed white women to be given a legal status of citizen, but blocked her access to the other dimensions of citizenship, such as participating in government, the vote, owning property, serving on a jury, etc. So this notion that women's citizenship, or white women's citizenship, was an extension of her husband's citizenship was one of the main arguments against granting women the right to vote. As the logic held, if she's merely an extension of her husband, married men would get 2 votes. That's not fair. Or the other idea, which was that what if she disagreed with her husband? That would cause marital strife. That's not good. The courts often describe this in terms of national loyalty. A white man's national loyalty is to the nation state. A white woman's national loyalty was to her husband. In fact, the presumption of women's national loyalty that followed her husband even allowed Congress to denaturalize thousands of American women in 1907. The Expatriation Act of 1907 declared that any woman who was married to a non-citizen automatically lost her US citizenship. Historians aren't sure if there are thousands or tens of thousands of women who lost their citizenship at this time. It was clear, though, in this act, similar to anti-miscegenation laws, white women who introduced foreign elements into the body politic would be punished. The gendering of citizenship directly impacted Native American communities. In 1807 Dawes Act, Congress offered citizenship to Native American men only if they emerged as property-owning heads of households. This assimilationist project attempted to abolish kinship practices and replace them with patriarchal, nuclear, heterosexual family formations. So this carrot of citizenship was offered as the reward for changing whole ways of being for these nations, such as diluting matriarchal practices and the roles of female elders in these nations. This also resulted in the loss of more than 90 million acres of treaty land. The other side of citizenship law, or we can look at naturalization law on one hand, but another way to look at citizenship is immigration law. Immigration law tells the other side of the story. The first immigration law in the United States at a federal level is the 1875 Page Act, which targeted Chinese women, specifically claiming that Chinese women were likely to be sex workers and therefore should be barred from migration. Let me repeat that. the first federal immigration law targeted Chinese women because white politicians presumed they were sex workers. In 1882, Congress followed up with the Chinese Exclusion Act, a law that barred the Chinese as particularly and especially un-American or alien, a term that unfortunately we still use today. Congress slowly lightened the restrictions in 1943, but didn't truly end Chinese exclusion until the 1960s. There are so many more examples of immigration law and naturalization laws and ways that we control citizenship. The point here is that people of color and white women have had to challenge the US nation state to access the status of citizenship, while white men have not. Rather, whiteness has been a prerequisite, meaning a requirement for people to be designated as a citizen throughout the history of the United States. But I'm also being too literal here. That is, I'm focusing on one aspect of citizenship, but there are other avenues to take. So far, I've been talking about citizenship as a status that is legally conferred by the nation state. This is one of the most common ways we talk about citizenship. That is, we might ask, am I a citizen in the United States? Are you a citizen in the United States? And is this something we would find marked on our passport, for example, or other legal documents? But citizenship scholars have pointed out that the legal designation on a passport or your birth certificate only encompasses a very small part of citizenship because it doesn't actually tell us what it means to be able to access the full rights and privileges of citizenship. Drink. So let's pause for a minute and talk about what citizenship is exactly. Because honestly, it's a much tougher and slippery term than most people realize. Citizenship scholars, legal scholars, and judges have struggled over the definition, admitting that what appears to be this common sense, as in, we use this term, citizenship, citizen, citizenry, be a good citizen, etc., all the time, we're not exactly sure what that means. So a political scientist, Rogers M. Smith, who's one of the specialists in citizenship, conducted this book-length study. He said he wanted to figure out finally, once and for all, what in the world is citizenship? So he has a bunch of graduate students work together, and he does this huge project that I think takes at least 10 years. It's a 700-page tome, but Smith actually summed up his findings by stating, quote, American citizenship has always been an intellectually puzzling, legally confusing, and politically charged and contested status. In his study, he argued that there were at least 14 types of citizenship or 14 dimensions to it. Scholars over time have said, let's just focus on 4. So when we look at the 4 dimensions of citizenship, this is where citizenship scholars tend to agree. Citizenship as a legal status and a legally conferred identity. This is what I've been discussing so far. There's also citizenship as a political activity, as in the ability to participate politically, such as voting, participating in government, etc. 3, citizenship as rights, as in the ability to have rights, often in exchange with having some responsibility or obligation to the state. And lastly, citizenship as social membership. That is the ability to be socially seen as or recognized or included as a member. Traditionally, scholars have thought about citizenship in relationship to nation states. So tend to see these 4 dimensions in relationship to government and nation state. But citizenship speak is actually much more fluid. We see it a lot more common. There's corporate citizenship. I often get notices from my campus about being a good citizen to my university. So there are other ways that this word and concept comes up. You'd even be surprised about how often it comes up. So more recently, scholars have recognized that citizenship can also be in relationship to a community. It could be a global community, a political or social community, or even smaller designations. Regardless of the size and the scope of this more expansive understanding of citizenship, a person's access to that participation, rights, and status are all qualified by the social. That is, your access to 1, 2, and 3 of citizenship, scholars have found number 4 is the key. And without number 4, you're not going to be able to access the other 3. Let me say this again in a different way. Scholars have found that if a person does not have the fourth dimension, that is not seen or recognized as a member of whatever community of citizens we're focusing on, they are not able to access any of the other dimensions of citizenship that includes, in particular, the rights and the privileges. Let's use an example. One found from the history of whiteness. Because whiteness, what is it? Who has it? What does it entail? Is hotly contested. But as I said before, the US legal system has always presumed whiteness at least gives you, number one, the legal status or legally conferred identity. But some folks were considered white in the legal sense, but were not always included in the social sense. Irish Americans, as one example. Historically, Irish experienced segregation, discrimination, especially in the mid-19th century. During this time, anti-Irish, anti-Roman Catholic sentiments circulated throughout the United States. In some cases, Irish were actually barred from applying for certain jobs, and political organizations worked really hard to exclude Irish Catholics from the vote or for running from political office. The Know Nothings in particular, the Know Nothings movement, was a nativist anti-immigrant movement that focused on, quote, America for Americans. They actually meant America for white Protestants from certain European countries of origin. In Kentucky, for example, you have Bloody Monday in Louisville in 1858, when the Know Nothings actually attacked the German and Irish neighborhoods in an attempt to keep them from voting. At least 22 people were murdered that day. This is no doubt an example of how the Irish experienced discrimination and violence and were at least temporarily thwarted from accessing the full privileges of citizenship. But I want to emphasize the distinction. Legally, the Irish were deemed white. Courts never wavered in finding that Irish were white, and therefore were legally granted citizenship. But as white Protestants actively worked to block Irish Americans from the vote, Irish Americans were not able to access their political rights to citizenship. That is to say, because they were not deemed social members of the nation during this time period, they were not able to access their citizenship. It should be noted that in order to make Irish othered, that is to make them appear scary, not able to be assimilated, and not worthy of being a member of the US nation state in the mid-19th century, the Irish were often portrayed as being like African Americans. Media representations, especially from the Know Nothings, consistently figured Irish as nearly African American in their imagery, descriptions, and even in their propaganda. The othering the Irish required that they be associated away from whiteness and towards Blackness. It's this kind of imagery that Irish Americans would fight for years to come. And let me underscore this point. The temporary lack of access to their full privileges of citizenship for Irish Americans required their association with Blackness and away from whiteness. But for communities in which their whiteness was never an option, their citizenship has been hotly contested. Historically, they have not been able to access the full privileges of citizenship. Recall that first quality or aspect of citizenship I talked about earlier. Citizenship is a legal status or legally conferred identity. We can recount the histories I started the talk with earlier today, and we can keep going. Legally speaking, people of color have been actively told they are not eligible for the legal status of citizen. Courts have even had to clarify whether or not various rights to citizenship could be applied to people of color. And for communities in which their whiteness was never an option, accessing the second and third elements of citizenship encompasses and describes the history of civil rights in the United States. That is, civil rights activism has been working for these number 2 and number 3 for quite some time. Being able to vote, being able to own land, being able to serve on a jury, basic rights of citizenship in the United States have been huge sites of struggle for communities of color, especially women of color. Consider, for example, the 19th Amendment that granted the woman the right to vote in 1920. At this time, it it would still take decades for women of color to access this vote. Most Native American women, for example, were not considered citizens in 1920. And women of color were unable to access voting rights due to a variety of different kinds of blocks: poll taxes, literacy tests, voter ID restrictions, residency requirements, and good old physical and mental intimidation by white citizens. This is one of the main reasons legal scholars have had to point out that being equal in word is not the equivalent of being equal in practice. So I confess I can hear criticisms in my head, don't worry. I hear them often. And they're in particular something like, yeah, Amy, I get it. These are old laws. This is the past. Come on. This is history. Get over it. We've made all these great changes. We're now an equal society. We're colorblind. Yeah. Now, legal scholars and civil rights and myself would beg to differ. Communities of color are still fighting, let's say, for the vote. Not too many years ago, the Supreme Court actually ruled in Shelby County v. Holder that the pre-clearance formula for the Voting Rights Act was no longer valid. Justice Ginsburg argued that voting discrimination actually isn't, the old formulas are no longer in use. There are new ways that people are being blocked from vote. She said that they have actually evolved into much more subtle and onerous voting rights abuses. In fact, she said the majority of the court ignored Congress had actually compiled 15,000 pages of evidence that Congress acquired in order to show that people are still being blocked from the vote and that race has a lot to do with it. But as I mentioned earlier, one quality of citizenship reigns over others, and that's that final one. Citizenship as a social membership. So social membership, to be able to be seen and included as a member, in this case as a socially included member of the nation, this aspect of citizenship trumps, pun intended, trumps all others. It's this aspect of citizenship that directly kept Irish Americans from their full rights of citizenship in the 1850s. And it's this aspect of citizenship that still haunts people of color, especially women of color and gender nonconforming and trans people of color today. Now, how do you become recognized or seen as, included as a member of the nation? Okay, historically, scholars have argued that national unity was created through newspapers, through magazines, and other forms of media. It's through these forms of media that national conversations take place and kind of create a national feeling. Of course, we're in a different time, and it's certainly much harder to track how to figure out a national conversation in this internet age. If we understand one aspect of our current moment, it's that our national conversations are more disaggregated than ever. It's here that I actually think of Donald Trump. I think of Donald Trump especially in a particular way here, because if there's one thing I think folks across the political spectrum can agree on here in regards to Donald Trump, it's that he knows how to be the center or remain the center or become the center of a national conversation, even in this disaggregated age of the internet. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Donald Trump gets to determine whether or not people can be included as social members of the nation. But I am saying that due to his ability to steer national media alongside the deluge of administrative actions by his administration during his presidency, his actions and his speech, again, during his presidency, had the ability to create social memberships or lack thereof. The examples of the various statements that Trump made via tweet or in the rallies that has conveyed his dislike or distaste for numerous communities is endless. And quite frankly, I got overwhelmed looking at all of it. Just during the presidency alone, he had over 25,000 tweets. And the ability and energy to go through them all was not there for me. But it's also not as important. When I think of the tweets, though, the one thing I wanted to point out about them is that they have an afterlife. That is, they have much more effect than another's comments or thoughts or feelings. Because unlike you or me, media actually continues to kind of cover and repeat and rethink over and over these comments. They have an afterlife, a repetition. And in that repetition, one could argue they get increasingly more meaningful. Their pain and violation, for example, accumulate. To have a newspaper or a bunch of talking heads debate about how offensive or not a comment by the President of the United States is, it's understandably newsworthy, but it's also adding insult to injury. But as I said, we don't really have the time to go through all of those, and they're not as important anyway compared to the administrative actions. That's him in his role as president. So let's focus and narrow our just on the legal changes and administrative actions that were taken during the Trump administration. Actually, let's just focus on a small percentage of them. Again, completely overwhelmed, because they are extensive, numerous, and far too many. Honestly, I only have time to touch on a few of them. These two slides mention just some of the reports that are out there in regards to Trump's administration. If you were paying attention, every day a new administrative or legal change was made by the Trump administration, at least one, that removed someone's rights, violated someone's rights, or placed significant barriers to accessing those rights. According to most scholars, the Trump administration removed more rights than any administration in our history. There's another section too. The Trump administration's rollback and decimation of rights ranged from large legal changes to smaller administrative changes, that it still had a huge impact on people's lives. Let me just name a few. The Muslim ban in its different variations barred travel from the United States from several Muslim majority countries. The Trump administration attempted to end, or at least froze, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA program for undocumented youth. The Trump administration severely cut refugee and asylum programs, including ending asylum rights for those experiencing domestic violence and running from gang violence, which directly impacted many LGBTQ migrants running for their lives. Trump administration barred transgender people from serving in the military, withdrew legal actions protecting transgender children and trans people in the workplace, and actively argued that trans people are not protected under civil rights. They administered the so-called zero tolerance policy, which took migrant children away from their parents and ignored longstanding laws and policies that placed strict limits on how long any child should be put in detention. They removed any mentions of gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender from the whitehouse.gov website. They drastically cut aid for domestic violence shelters, programs, and the national hotline. They halted the Obama administration's plans to enact and create equal pay regulations that would actually require women to be paid the same as men when they're doing the same work. The list goes on and on. If you were paying attention, every day you could wake up to the loss of another right, or another tweet that would question your worth as a human being. It's these constant actions and messages that not only exclude people of color, transgender people, and even white women from the full benefits of citizenship. It's these constant messages and actions that not only undermine one's ability to access these full privileges of citizenship, to even feel included, but to also even feel safe, and rightfully so. As much as these constant messages can tell people they are not members of the nation, they also give license to other people to harm, disparage, and even enact physical violence against them. Consider the examples of hate crime incidents in the name of Trump and implemented by people who said they were inspired by Trump and his administration. Or just notice that hate crime incidents went up at least 20% during 2016 to 2019. We still don't have the data on 2020 yet. This report does not include the majority of hate crime incidents, as they tend to go underreported. The FBI in each report says, we know that we are being underreported because many people do not tell police that they experience a hate crime. One of the main reasons is that most folks that experience hate crime violence don't feel safe going to the police about it. Therefore, they're notoriously underreported. We've also got mass shootings and violence that's been perpetuated by white supremacists. 2017 mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where we lost 11 people. 2019 massacre in Christchurch, New Zealand, the mosque, when we lost 51 people. We have a man who opened fire in Walmart in El Paso that killed 23 people. Of course, I am not saying that Trump caused this violence. I'm saying that when folks create this kind of violence, associating themselves with Trump, it continues to participate in all of these feelings of being vulnerable. We even have, of course, the Trump supporters who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, some of which were meant there to protest. Others had quite dangerous and violent motives that were targeting politicians, especially targeting women of color politicians. Again, I'm not saying Trump is responsible for this violence. I'm merely pointing out that community of color, transgender women, and migrants, if you're having any fear during this time, it's justified. This fear, this constant bombardment of messages, laws, and administrative actions that target certain communities is to terrorize those communities. Terrorism is a loaded term. It's come to take on a lot of meanings, especially racialized ones. But let me point out here, I'm talking about what it means to terrorize a group of people or a community, to undermine their sense of belonging, and to undermine their sense of safety. So it might surprise you that terrorism, like citizenship, is a term that we think we understand, but is far more complicated. I'm not going to walk through all the scholarship on terrorism today, especially as I'm wrapping up here, but I will summarize it briefly for you. Terrorism scholars agree that they don't agree on the definition. One of the main reasons for this is because they admit it's so loaded. It's been charged with meaning. One scholar's terrorist act could be another scholar's military action, could be another scholar's revolution. Scholars differ on whether or not terrorism, does it require physical violence, or can it just include the threat of violence? But either way, there's a general consensus that there is a goal of terrorism, and that's to create the conditions of uncertainty and fear. Again, let me say that there is a general consensus that the goal of terrorism is to create conditions of uncertainty and fear. Terrorism functions through psychic reverberations or impact on the psyche of a group of people, telling them that they are in danger and under the threat of violence. To terrorize a group of people is not just to physically harm them. It's also to make them feel that that harm could be enacted at any time. Our best example of terrorism in the United States is the organized and disorganized lynching of people of color, particularly in the early 20th century. While we might be most familiar with the lynching practices of the KKK in the South, the reality is that lynching was far more widespread and far more common. The horrific violence of lynching not only murdered people, not only creating the psychic conditions in which people of color were put on notice that they were always vulnerable, always in danger, and always potential victims. But what's harder too is we know that the lines between who participated in the lynching and who did not were quite blurry. Lynchings often drew huge crowds of white spectators. Police were often not only present, but participants in the lynching. Photographers took pictures of the lynchings. They were social events. These pictures became postcards that were then sent across the world. Luckily, you can't see this image that well. That's on purpose. An image of murdering, usually Black and brown men, were put on postcards to be shared and moved across the world. That's terrorism, creating the conditions in which people of color, or in our case currently, transgender people and migrants are marked as outsiders, vulnerable to violence at any time by anyone. It's this form of terrorism, this condition of violence that I'm talking about today. It's easy to say lynching is in the past if we ignore the recent examples of lynching that have occurred in the United States. It's easy to say that terrorizing people of color is in the past if we ignore the tweets, the legal actions, and the constant debates in our media about whether or not this or that is racist, if this or that person is worthy. It's easy to say that women of color have the same rights as white women if we ignore how many women of color are policed, harassed, and experience discrimination on a daily basis. It's easy to claim that transgender people have rights and privileges in the so-called liberal society if we ignore the horrific numbers of trans women of color that have been murdered by transphobic men. It's easy to claim that violence is in our past if we keep ignoring the violence of our present. But it's also foolish to think that violence in the past isn't still impacting us today, right now. Violence and the pain of discrimination, they don't just fade away. They don't dissipate over time. They're not just over. Violence and the pain of discrimination actually accumulate. They accumulate in generations on people. It gathers, hoards, and amasses as time moves forward. The violence of the past keeps piling up, constantly told to wait for a future in which all people will eventually be granted the full privileges of citizenship. We can't afford to wait for a better, less violent tomorrow because so many people in the United States without full citizenship, for them, there is no citizenship, there is no future, there is no time to waste. That's my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Branzell. Next, we have Dr. Mireille Pardon giving their response.
Excellent, thank you so much. And a huge thank you to Dr. Branzell. I found your talk incredibly illuminating, so much so that it was hard for me to keep my remarks for over 5 minutes, but I've endeavored to do that to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. I'm struck by the endurance of two phenomena. First, how those in power develop fantasies of persecution and then are able to weaponize that imagined persecution against marginalized communities. And second, how the mere presence of rhetoric of freedom does not necessarily mean that everyone is free and can in fact be used for exclusion. I hope that no one regrets asking a medieval historian to respond to this talk because I will be taking us into the Middle Ages to elaborate on these 2 points. Medieval European society was characterized by hegemonic Christianity. Europeans who spoke different languages, had different customs and different ethnic identities, saw themselves as part of a unified Christendom. In a society with little separation between church and state, Jews and Muslims living within Christendom were marked out as other, sometimes even physically. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council mandated that they had to wear some form of identifying badge or otherwise distinctive clothing. Non-Christians lived within a Christian society, but were never quite part of that society. The Christian majority of medieval Europe invented fantasies of their own persecution to justify violence against Jews and Muslims. These fantasies took the form of anti-Semitic myths, such as blood libel, the idea that Jewish communities are going around and kidnapping Christian children and performing ritual murders. While such myths may seem sort of far-fetched today, these fantasies of oppression resulted in real-life persecution, Jewish expulsions from towns or entire countries, as well as violence against Jewish communities. We see similar rhetoric used to justify the Crusades. The Crusades being a series of violent incursions into the Middle East starting in the 11th century, as well as military action against non-Christians within Europe. Popes and kings encouraged knights to take up arms in defense of Christendom, a Christendom that they saw as under attack, and promised spiritual rewards for violence against non-Christians. So when we talk about the tendency to situate whiteness as vulnerable, in trouble, needing protection, I see continuity in how those with the most power in society can use imagined oppression as a tool to continue their oppression of others. Perhaps this comparison to whiteness is not even that far-fetched. Medieval Europeans had a racialized understanding of religious difference, and the same theological frameworks that were used to justify the enslavement of non-Christians in the medieval period would only need to be modified very slightly to justify enslavement based on race. The second enduring phenomenon I would like to draw attention to has to do with how much Americans like to talk about freedom. We are the land of the free, and particularly rhetoric around citizenship. Citizenship itself is framed as gaining that American freedom. Yet, as Dr. Brenzel has discussed, it's more complicated than that, and not everyone has had the same access to freedom. I would like to point out that this is not the only context in which freedom can act almost like a sort of doublespeak, establishing a category of the free to the exclusion of others. So in popular culture, America likes to sort of situate their democratic ideals and concept of citizenship as stemming from Greco-Roman traditions. The far more proximate antecedent, though, is the citizenship of a European nation state. And the citizenship of a European nation state directly derives from the concept of town citizenship in the medieval period. Sorry, we are again back to the Middle Ages. The concept of a town in the Middle Ages is based on a charter that grants certain rights and privileges. Such documents include a lot of rhetoric of freedom, since the legal category of urban citizen freed someone from feudal obligations to the aristocracy. We see this in the expression, Stadtlucht macht frei, the town air makes one free. Yet what exactly did that freedom mean? Certainly, Jews and Muslims in European towns were subject to not the same regulations, and similarly, town freedom meant different things to men than it did to women. In medieval towns, the freedom of the urban citizenry was invoked for purposes of exclusion as well, through the harsh criminalization of vagrancy and laws regulating migration into towns. The category of a free person or citizen has sharp boundaries that can be tightened for purposes of exclusion. The town air may have made some people free, but not all. Similarly, we see a strong emphasis on freedom in Enlightenment thought. The French slogan, liberté, égalité, fraternité, comes to mind. And from philosophical texts to political movements, European Enlightenment thinking loved ideas of freedom and equality. And yet, this is the same intellectual environment where scientific racism flourished. To be clear, I don't think that people writing medieval town charters or Enlightenment political treatises were trying to sort of pull the wool over everyone's eyes and think, oh, if I just repeat the word freedom enough, no one will notice that not everyone's free. Instead, they simply thought that freedom only applied to certain people, or in some cases that personhood only applied to certain people. The omnipresent rhetoric of freedom in modern American discourse can sometimes have a similar feel. This obsession with the word freedom and liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of political opinion on college campuses, the mere rhetoric of freedom is ultimately meaningless without further interrogation. And most of all, we can't only take the voices of those in power to tell us whether or not our society is free. And secondly, we should be very cognizant of how violence can be justified when those in power declare that it is in fact they themselves who are under attack. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pardon. And thank you to everyone for your generative questions. We're going to start with a question from JJ Kiboy, one of our students at Berea College. JJ asks, in light of the white supremacist attack yesterday in Atlanta, where 8 Asian women were killed, it is essential that the level of xenophobia or anti-Asian rhetoric that is peddled by Western media and both American political parties, not only during this time of COVID-19, but also Cold War fear-mongering, the PAGE Act, Chinese Exclusion Act, and the myriad of examples of xenophobia that is ingrained in the American psyche. What are your overall thoughts about the level of xenophobia in the age of COVID-19? And can you speak on how whiteness is particularly violent towards Asian immigrant women within racial capitalism and imperialism?
That is a fantastic question. Thank you so much. The anti-Asian violence that has been rampant, especially since over the last year, captures and just takes place, and it's that part of that accumulation I was talking about, where it's added and loaded onto the anti-Asian rhetoric that's been going on in the United States for so long. There were so many ways Asian American scholars have pointed out how that embeddedness of using Chinese or Asian as almost meaning the opposite of citizenship in the United States, that long history of doing that work is still with us very much today. And that's why so easily and quickly, anyone who's associated with as an Asian American gets quickly kind of thrown into the non-citizen category. I haven't been able to track the recent any updates on what more of the details about what happened in that situation. So I can't really speak to that per se, but I can say that the anti-Asian violence is so rampant in our society that we have, and it's not surprising given the kinds of conditions that we've been setting forth over the last 4 years, but also the way that then that so was maneuvered into blaming the Chinese for COVID.
Thank you so much, Dr. Branzell. Dr. Pardon, do you have any comments to share?
No, not anything particular besides to sort of echo the things that Dr. Branzell has said.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Berea College professor, Dr. Roy Scudder Davis. Dr. Scudder Davis says, Dr. Branzell, your talk, at least at the beginning, emphasizes white terrorism in the history of the United States. We can also point to extremist groups in the US today that could be characterized as white terrorists. How can we separate those individuals who can be characterized in this way from others who identify as white that do not share their ideology? Is it all just being white? Dr. Scudder Davis continues by contextualizing his question. I identify as a US citizen. I am African American. In spite of these facts, I feel a part of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Trail of Tears, slavery, etc., because I do identify with this country. Can I dissociate myself from these crimes because I belong to a subset of that group? Can I place the blame solely on, quote, whites, even if I feel a kinship with those individuals as fellow citizens?
That's a fantastic question, and so much there. So I'll try to get to some of it at least. First, I'm really appreciative because I think you can tell that I am not interested in trying to describe terrorism as just the extreme. So often, what's happened around discourses around racism is that it's being described as it has to encompass the most extreme version. So like it has to be a white supremacist, that equals racism, but all these other kinds of forms of racism then kind of become meaningless or become diluted in their power or their responsibility. And the same thing kind of happens around terrorizing people. I didn't want to, when I had this talk planned and then the January 6th thing happened and I'm like, oh no, that's gonna really that's gonna shift all of our thinking towards like, that's what terrorism looks like. And it's like, that's a form of terrorism and that's an extreme form of terrorism. But look at all these other ways in which we have terrorism in the United States. I also want to say too, that I think taking responsibility or culpability or a sense of responsibility, it's not as much a matter of a personal kind of maneuver, but a collective maneuver, right? Collectively, we take responsibility for the violence. We take responsibility for the ways in which racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, et cetera, are not only of our past, but are accumulated into our present. And so we have work to do. So it's that baggage and how much work we all have to do. But that, what role we all take in that baggage should be different. My role as a white settler is this kind of talk, right? This kind of work where it's like, that's where I'm going to put my energy. And I just invite everyone to put their energy where they can to try to unpack and unload and try to take responsibility for all of this baggage that we have.
Thank you, Dr. Branzell. Dr. Pardon, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, again, sorry to just be echoing things. But I was also struck by, I'm not sure I really think of a sort of disassociating guilt or personal responsibility, what's most important here. And instead, probably what's more important is understanding the connections between past and present structures. And the question of sort of how do we move forward? What can we do sort of more practically than sort of, should I feel a personal responsibility or not?
Thank you. I want to, for the sake of time, collapse 3 questions and they're related. So I think it'll make for a generative conversation to put them together. One of the questions asks, we're still witnessing the violence against people of color. However, I see many white individuals dismiss the systemic, legal, and individual violent acts of disenfranchisement as, quote, not me, and therefore, quote, not my problem or even worth discussion. How do you respond to this reaction? The second question asks, relatedly, what roles have white cisgender women played in maintaining the powers of white citizenship? Has our race and gender been weaponized in order to maintain white citizenship through exclusion and or oppression of other races and ethnicities? If so, who ultimately holds responsibility for its weaponization? And our last question, could you speak more to the issue of how patriot identity and its more radicalized forms like Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, and localized militias can expect the same kind of violence that they claim Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters, yet immunize themselves from critical attention?
Okay, those are wonderful. Thank you. First, I wanted to get to the privilege issue and thinking about cis white women and being and belonging, because the book that I've written is about that long kind of history around citizenship. And citizenship often has this promise that people will be included more and more, will become a more and more inclusive world as we go. But one of the tendencies is the minute a group is included, I'm not going to say that they're jerks, but I'm going to say that they don't seem to care as much about who's excluded anymore. They're like, kind of partying in the privilege. And so I think, and historically we've had examples of this. Historians have been finding this for quite some time. Like the minute that a group moves into having some kind of privilege into the norm or being included in the we of citizenship, they don't seem to worry about anyone else. And I think that's because of the exclusionary nature of citizenship, but also the promises of privilege, right? And how privilege itself is something that gets addictive and people really enjoy, and then wanting to safeguard, describe as potentially wounded, needing to put a bunch of media apparatus around it to make sure to show that it's got to be stayed safe. We've got to keep this privilege, it's in danger. So it's kind of this long history. So this is to say that cis white women have a long history of this responsibility, and it's something that I think in particular women in gender studies is a field of study that really works. That's one of its responsibilities is to account for that and to repair that history. I'm trying to think about that. One of the things that scholars have pointed out is that there's really an interesting different form of violence by folks that claim that they're doing it on behalf of the nation state. Those folks that see themselves as quote unquote patriotic or acting patriotically, I think of like the Minutemen or other examples of folks who empower themselves as non-state actors that are working on behalf of the state. And there's a way in which they can describe their violence as justified because it's in the name of the state, even if the state said, no, that's not what we said. So I'm not sure that answers that question, but I am very fascinated about that long history of folks claiming there's a form of violence that they can take that they're just helping the police out, or they're just helping immigration out, or they're just, we're gonna help you out. And that those forms of violence seemingly justified, seemingly taking violence as if it's state justified, just creates so much more violence. I might be stopping there because I forgot, but I want to hear other people.
Mireille, do you want to add?
Yeah, sorry, that was so many questions at once. I also maybe didn't have a good answer. I hope I'm not having the last word here. So please let someone else talk after me. But I did just want to talk slightly about sort of issues of how we justify violence in terms of the role of cisgender white women, that's often positioned as a sort of need for protection. And that is not to say that it's not the fault of cisgender white women. Certainly cisgender white women also are sort of part of that rhetoric as well, of saying that we need protection. And it's also applied to sort of children as well. And these sort of false myths and conspiracies of a specifically racialized danger that needs to be protected against. And that is one of the sort of roles that I think cisgender white women are particularly playing in this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Branzell and Dr. Pardon, for your really generative remarks. I want to thank everyone that came out. I believe at one point we had over 320 attendees. I'm really proud of the fact that Berea College showed up to have a difficult conversation. I hope that you all will show up again at our next Gender Talk on April 14th with Dr. Glenn Coulthard about Red Power Feminisms. Additionally, the Women's and Gender Studies Department is sponsoring a convocation on April 15th with Black Muslim woman Olympian Ibtihaj Muhammad. So we hope to see you at those events, and thank you again to Dr. Branzell and Dr. Pardon.
Thank you so much.